That was the last of this morning's programme.
In a normal winter, about 1/10 of the land in the northern hemisphere is covered by ice and snow. But there have been times when 1/3 of the land was in the grip of these conditions. These were periods of glaciation. Since the Ice Age began, less than 2 million years ago, there have been some 16 such glaciations, and Britain may first have felt one 800,000 years ago. Once started, they can last for tens of thousands of years. Although we are used to the presence of ice caps at the poles, it's in the temperate latitudes, where rainfall is normally high, that ice can build up quickly if the climate takes a relatively small turn for the worse. The glaciers that fill the valleys are born in the uplands, where huge areas of unmelting snow coalesce into ice sheets that ride over all but the highest peaks. Once engulfed by this white tide, a landscape is committed to irrevocable change. Fortunately for us, that there are no glaciers in Britain today. There is no ice moving in the hills of the British Isles. But the symptoms of that movement are throughout the western side of the country. And I'm standing at the mouth of a corrie in North Wales, where the symptoms of moving ice were first described in about 1842 by Charles Darwin, of all people. In fact, he described the little lumps at the back of the corrie as moraine dropped by the ice when it finally melted. This is a corrie which is the heart of a glacier. It's the place where the glacier begins, because snow and ice pile up until the weight of the amount of ice pushes the front forward and then out and down the valley. This movement gouges out the bottom of the corrie, and you can see a lake occupying it now. And I'm standing where the first effect of the moving ice is obvious, because ice with boulders held in its bottom has smoothed and polished this solid rock. On some of these smooth, rounded rocks, you can actually, in the right light, see that scratches have been caused in them by blocks held in the bottom of the ice. In this light, if I wet this, you may be able to see them a little better. The ice moved this way. My fingers are as though they are blocks in the ice, gouging scratches in the direction that the ice moved. They are totally different from the lines that are the structure of the rock itself. Even if the rocks don't bear these scratches or striations, they may be polished into rounded shapes like sheep. They're called roches moutonnées. The ice, with movement generated by its own weight in the corrie, flowed through the position I'm in now on this rock step. And as it went on, it plucked away the rock from the other side of the step, leaving it as we see it now. And down there you can see all the symptoms of a classic glaciated valley. It's generally U-shaped. The sides are over-steepened because rock was plucked off them. There is scree filling in the angle at the bottom, and the river in there is really quite irrelevant. It's nothing to do with the formation of the valley it now meanders through. Of course, these are all the super dramatic symptoms of glaciation up in the mountains, but we know now that the real significance of it to the whole country is that from all these mountainous areas, material was redistributed by ice over the lowland. The landscape we now walk about on and use is largely the product of a mantle of glacial material. So we really ought to now look at the mechanics of how all this worked. Newly fallen snow quickly loses its original crystalline form and becomes granular. If it survives the summer, more snow will pile up on top of it, and the weight packs the granules closer together until they change into solid ice. Gradually, under its own weight, the ice will begin to flow, rather like a viscous liquid. The movement of a glacier is undetectable to the eye, though it's flowing like a slow river at as little as a foot a day. Of course, the speed can vary with the conditions. The flow lines show that the central section moves faster than the edges, which are in frictional contact with the rock of the valley walls. Because of their size and weight, glaciers are powerful sculptors of rock, deepening and extending old river valleys, and sometimes even cutting new routes to accommodate their own large volume. Where two glaciers have cut troughs close together, only a narrow ridge of rock may remain. It's called an arête. At the heads of valleys where snow has first accumulated and plucked away the rock into corries, a whole mountain can be bitten away, leaving only a pyramidal peak, often called a horn. Glaciers leave other characteristic signs of their passage. The main glacier may overdeepen its valley, leaving original tributary valleys hanging, sometimes hundreds of feet above the main valley floor. Sometimes the thick glacier ice passed over an obstruction in its bed, like the hard volcanic plug on which Edinburgh Castle now stands. The basal ice carved deep channels round it, but left protected a long tail of weaker rock in the lee of the crag. This became, in the hands of man, the sloping streets we call the Royal Mile. This streamlining also shows up in the rather odd hills called drumlins, that are formed in some way under the ice, often in large numbers, and indicate the direction of the flow. As it descends from the high ground, the glacier eventually reaches warmer conditions and starts to melt. If this melting is balanced by snow accumulating higher up, the snout of the glacier will remain stationary. If the balance shifts and the snow accumulates faster than the melting, the glacier will advance. But if the melting is faster than the accumulation, the snout of the glacier will retreat, though the ice itself is always flowing forwards. At the snout, where much of the melting takes place, the rock debris which has been carried along by the ice is dropped, and when the snout stays in the same place for some time, a bank of debris forms along its front, called a moraine. A succession of moraines parallel to the ice front may mark the positions of the retreat of the snout, and many other landforms created by debris cover the landscape in front of a melting or decaying glacier, because at this stage of its life, a great deal of landscaping is done by the meltwater. A lot of melting takes place on the top surface of the glacier. Meltwater streams run along the ice, or carve their way down through it, or through crevasses. They emerge at the snout as fast-running torrents which cut channels for themselves through the moraine. When meltwater emerges from under the ice, it is loaded with mud and gravel, which it carries away to spread out over the glacial outwash plain. A stream, flowing in its own tunnel under the glacier, may build deposits of its burden, which will be exposed when the ice melts as a long, snake-like mound called an esker. And melting or glacier decay can have persistent effects on the countryside. A kettle hole may be formed when dead glacier ice incorporated into a moraine melts, leaving a roundish hole, which immediately turns into a small lake. Tens of thousands of years after the ice melted, there are quite a few of these kettle hole lakes surviving in Lincolnshire, Shropshire and Cheshire, though they often get filled in with peat. As the ice melts, it drops rocks of all sizes that it's been carrying along. Those brought from far away are called erratics. Here on the high ground of the Yorkshire Dales are the Norber erratics, huge blocks that remain where they were dropped by the ice, isolated when meltwater carried away the smaller fragments. These rocks are sandstone, lying on limestone, and you can see in this example perched on little limestone pedestals. How much weathering of the limestone has taken place since the ice melted 10,000 years ago. But this limestone is younger than the sandstone and normally lies on top of it. So what's happening here is that the ice has picked up sandstone blocks and carried them up hundreds of feet above their outcrop level and dropped them on top of the limestone. Erratic rocks are extremely useful in reconstructing the routes taken by glaciers, and they turn up in unlikely places like these cliffs at West Brunton. These soft, very collapsible cliffs are composed of material which was brought by ice sheets onto this North Norfolk landscape. Some of it was plastered on as the ice advanced, but most of it was dropped as the ice melted, or as some books say, as the ice retreated. Most of literature refers to it as boulder clay, but there isn't always a great deal of clay in it, so that a better word is probably till, which is a word Scottish farmers use for stony soils. And that's the critical thing about this stuff. It's full of stones from all kinds of places. Wherever the ice sheet passed, so it picked up pieces of rock. They are extracted from the cliff now by the sea, and therefore vast amounts left on the beach. Lots of it, of course, is of local origin, but you can find pebbles from all the sources which the ice has passed over. This, for instance, is a granite from Scotland. There's some lava with little quartz veins in it, and a piece of pure quartz that's very yellow stained. And this is what's known as a rhomb porphyry. There are little angular crystals of quartz standing out in it. That's from Scandinavia, certainly. And this is another chunk of quartz, but as you can see, it's very little rounded. It must have been plucked out of the boulder clay very recently by the sea. Otherwise, it would by now be a round pebble. It's now known that the ice sheets that deposited these cliffs moved down from Scotland and Scandinavia at least 130,000 years ago, and possibly a lot earlier. The two ice sheets coalesced and crept across the North Sea basin, which was probably then dry because obviously the sea was locked up in the ice, swept up onto this coastline, carrying with it everything that had been picked up, everything that had been ground out of the mountains of Scandinavia and Scotland, and dumping it all here, 30 meters thickness of it. And then as the ice retreated, of course, leaving it behind, so the sea level rose, translation back from ice to water, and it is now attacking the material it brought. And it's producing a cliff and a beach which provide us with this recreation area and the whole landscape behind it that we cultivate and work and live on. It's interesting that the most resistant parts of these very soft cliffs are in fact huge boulders. They're boulders some hundreds of meters long and tens of meters thick. Boulders of chalk that have almost certainly been plucked up by the ice at the last stages as it came ashore here in North Norfolk. And it includes, of course, much smaller boulders of chalk that look like the common idea of a boulder. Inland, behind the cliffs, you can also find material that appears to have been transported by meltwater streams. Heavier gravels where the streams ran swiftly, and finer sand where they slowed. Man has been quarrying the coarser deposits for roadstone, while the finer sand has also been quarried for nest sites by the sand martins. But however old these deposits may be, we know that nearly 500,000 years ago, the ice sheets travelled even further south than the Norfolk coast. Below the fertile fenlands in East Anglia lie deposits of till that have flattened and concealed the whole topography of hills and valleys created in the pre-glacial past. Indeed, the ice may have passed this way more than once. It's hard to date the material, and in any case, each glaciation obliterated many of the land features of those that went before. All we can do at present is summarise where the ice got to in the British Isles. Whenever the first glaciation struck, the ice reached its maximum advance about 400,000 years ago. We know that there were two major phases of glaciation, and there were probably several minor pulses within them. During these glaciations, the River Thames was twice diverted southward to take up its present course. The Warwickshire Avon was reversed from a northeasterly flow into the Trent to a southwesterly flow into the Severn, partly because of the formation of a huge lake at the edge of the advancing ice front. Yet the ice eventually melted, only to return about 26,000 years ago. This glaciation, too, caused a big lake to form when its front lay near Whitchurch. All this ice had melted away when, about 12,000 years ago, it suddenly started to grow again in Scotland, in what's called the Loch Lomond Re-Advance. Valley glaciers also formed again in the Lake District and in North Wales around Harlech. So it's in these areas that the signs of glaciation are best preserved. In all these highlands, ice, as much as rock type, has determined the shaping of what we think of as the mountain scenery. At Achnasheen in Rossshire, the valley is almost blocked by strange flat-top platforms. These are terraces, which were laid down by meltwater streams rushing away from the glacier, which stood in what is now the loch. The steep sides of the ice contact slope show up clearly, though the terraces are gradually being eroded by a new river. Further west, the lochs and glens show younger scars from the last of the ice, which are still fresh to the eyes of geomorphologist Dr. Brian Sissons.
This is the place in northwest Scotland, in Glentorridon, where a glacier ended about 10,000 years ago. We're standing on a ridge of debris deposited by the ice, and this extends away from us in a great curve, sweeping round at the mouth of the glen. The debris was brought down by the ice and dumped at its terminus, and it forms a ridge because the ice was advancing at the same rate as it was melting back, so the edge of the ice actually remained stationary. This ridge is preceded by another one further out to the right. The river runs along the left side of the ridge we're standing on, and then beyond the river is yet another ridge marking a later position of the glacier terminus. All of these ridges are formed of boulders and other debris dumped by the ice at its terminus. There were many other glaciers descending to Glentorridon from either side, and they too brought down debris from the high ground, dumping sometimes extensive areas of boulders which have been torn off the bedrock, sometimes leaving large areas of hummocks let down from the ice when it finally decayed. The material in these hummocks is boulders and finer debris, including very fine particles ground down by the great power of the ice, and this is best shown in sections in this material cut by rivers or sometimes made artificially by man.
Only a few miles away from Glentorridon, in the Applecross Peninsula, the recent glaciation created truly spectacular valleys. Sometimes they drop abruptly for hundreds of feet, marking ice falls of the glacier, and the valley floors still bear the bumps and hollows, the debris and the huge erratic blocks that the ice left on its way to the sea. But if this new debris is the result of the most recent re-advance, the valleys themselves were cut by repeated glaciation over the whole span of time since Britain first entered the Ice Age. This is the highest pass in the country, and up here there has probably been, for tens of thousands of years at a time, an ice field feeding the valley glaciers, with a series of deep corries to the north and east, where snow could gather out of reach of the sun's warmth. But some of the landscape features constructed by the ice were transient and can only be understood by interpreting the clues they left behind. In Inverness-shire, just south of the Great Glen, the front of the ice mass advancing from the north and west apparently dammed up lakes at different heights in several previously interconnected valleys. The legendary parallel roads that run along the valley walls, especially in Glenroy, mark successive stands of the water each time it flooded out to a lower level through escape channels uncovered as the ice front receded. In fact, most of the lakes we enjoy today owe their existence to glaciation. The ice scooped out rock basins which rivers now keep filled. Beautiful Loch Lomond, 23 miles long, was made in just this way, though once it was invaded by the sea when sea level was higher. Elsewhere in Scotland, there are now many sea lochs, fjords, where the glaciers have gouged out troughs below what is now sea level, so that the valleys have drowned. Sometimes, when the ice reached the end of the valley and spread out, it lost its cutting power, leaving a bar of bedrock. When the ice was at its maximum, the sea level was hundreds of feet lower than it is today. But when the ice had all melted, it rose higher than today's level. We can see quite clearly the wave-cut rock platforms and cliffs that the sea made at that time. Some of them are now nearly 100 feet above the reach of the surf. This is because the land, freed of its burden of ice, started to rise. Sometimes we manage to make good use of such features. At the seaward end of Loch Broom, a raised beach deposited by that higher sea level provides the magnificent site of the town of Ullapool. A great deal of land is still in the throes of recovery from these comparatively recent events. In heavily glaciated areas like northwest Scotland, the old rock was repeatedly stripped bare and polished by the ice, and has still gathered very little soil on its surface. Up here, it isn't hard to believe that a climatic temperature drop of only 2 or 3 degrees centigrade would bring back glaciers to the glens. Britain is still far colder than she ever was before the Ice Age began, and the permanent snowline of Europe lurks less than 1,000 feet above our highest peaks. A temperature drop of 8 to 9 degrees centigrade would bring back ice sheets, and then only the peaks would escape their cold embrace.